So, welcome back to Be the Change podcast. I'm so happy to bring to us today Joanna Brown. So, Joanna is really high in the tech space. We've met probably through TechNL, Pequity, different things that we're involved in together. And you play a big role in providing strategies to organizations, entrepreneurship, sales advisor. And most recently, I guess within the past year, you started your own business, Rivet.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. It's so funny, hey, like you run into people at all the same times, and so it's actually been really interesting since we met to kind of follow along with your journey as well. And when you launched the podcast and your business, anyways, I'm a big fan. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different topics. Let's start talking first about all the different benefits when we start stepping outside our comfort zones and what that looks like for you and for people in general. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I mean, I'm a big fan. I do think the biggest growth happens when you do something that's outside your comfort zone or when you get stretched. And so when I look back at maybe some of the parts that I found more pivotal in my career, it's been when I've kind of walked into rooms or done tasks and I'm like, am I really qualified for this? Like, where's the adults here? What's happening? Do I have to lead this? Is that okay? And but I've always been really curious. And so I've always kind of had within reason, I'm not going to go into a medical profession and say I know what I'm up to. But I've always felt pretty comfortable otherwise that, on the business side, if someone can figure it out, I can figure it out. And so I just had that in the back of my mind. And when I started working in tech, I just started taking on different things and I asked for more roles and I asked for more responsibilities and I just kind of did things. I just got stuff done, and in doing that, sometimes I really questioned what I was doing, but I learned a lot very quickly. And I think most people could look back at a certain time in their career or a certain time in their life where they think, you know what, like I grew a lot doing that. And when I look back at my own pieces, it's when I was doing something that I probably had no right doing, like that was really when I kind of saw a lot of growth. And so normally when I would be asked that question, I always kind of think to work things, right? And what that looks like. And there's a whole bunch of examples that come in. But I think now more in the recent years, I would say my own personal growth is also a lot in how I kind of blend my queerness and how I, build that into my business life. And that wasn't really something that I had ever thought about because I always thought your personal life, your business life. And the, older I got and the more people I worked with, those start to blend a little bit because you really, can become friends with the people you work with. Whether you're an advisor, whether you're working day to day with them. And so I think the more I think about that for now, my kind of challenge is more like, how do I grow in that space, in that representation space?
Absolutely. So that's interesting because there is a perception of some people's perception of just kind of leave your, identity or sexual orientation at the door. We don't really need to talk about it because work is work, right? So that kind of mentality. And so it's interesting. I know when I started kind of coming into my own self and what that is, and, I see all the different flags I have in the background because I want people to know and be comfortable with who they're working with for me as a person. And I get that vibe about you as well. Like just, it's okay. Like we can have conversations. They can be awkward. They can be difficult, around business and what that looks like. So for people that are trying to find their own space, like what are your thoughts about that, about people kind of just being able to be themselves and being able to be authentic, really?
Yeah. And it's so funny you say that as kind of your perception because of kind of how I am, because I'm actually really uncomfortable on that side of the shop. I think I started in kind of the consulting space where it was very like business is business. And I have some really great mentors and friends and things that I built along the way there, but it was very buttoned up. It was very like, no, we are business and business is business. And I could sit here for 8 hours and talk to you about boring like proposals. I could endlessly, like, I mean, like, buckle up. I could talk endlessly about that. You would be nauseated by the time I would actually finish with how comfortable I am talking about any business topic in depth. But when it comes to the personal or the blend, I'm actually like very uncomfortable normally speaking about that. But what I found was, well, there's the whole backstory of this, but I think representation matters more than ever now. And while I am a very proud gay person, I've always been proud to be gay. There's not one time I've doubted it or doubted my self-worth because of it. But I am not really I'm not really an activist when it comes to it. And so playing in any kind of forward facing role is actually really uncomfortable. But I just think that with everything that's going on in the world, like there's just no more time for that. So I think representation really matters. And so if I can kind of make myself a bit uncomfortable and do that, then I'm going to do it. So I do when I can point it out. I do when I can talk about my personal life because I think it's important. And just to go to the backstory of it a little bit. So I mentioned like I kind of came out in university, and so I was figuring things out. And I again, like I was very proud, like always, once I figured that out, I was like, great, and onwards, And I talked to a lot of people and I remember sitting around once and they were talking about, it's silly. People say, is it a choice or not? And I remember thinking like, well, what does it matter? Like, then great, I choose to be gay and onwards, And when we went around that room, most of the people who I thought were very proud would actually not have chosen to be gay because of all the things that come with that and what you have to be aware of and how you live your life. And I was shocked. I mean, that was kind of the start of my shock. And then I kind of started focusing on what that looks like and kind of paying attention ever since then. And it's sad that people feel they have to hide a little bit. And so my goal is for myself to grow, but also if it can be representation that can be helpful to others, then great.
Absolutely. And, I didn't come out until I was 31 and a half, which is, I always put the half in there. And proud of that half. But that's old, right? Like, because growing up in Catholic schools, growing up in traditionalist families, I'll call it. But having said that, my parents were perfectly great when I came out, but you just don't know. We don't know people's reactions. We don't know coworkers' reactions. When we're in business, it's just like, I don't know, like, should I first mention this? Like when I was, when I had long blonde hair, like I had more of a pass per se, like more of a covering piece, right? But just looking at future generations coming into workspaces, like we want them to come in and be proud of who they are and to be able to talk about their loved ones, put a picture on their desks of whomever they want and just be considered part of, the workplace. That inclusiveness that's missing in some workplaces, just changing the conversation. So you've worked in lots of different workspaces. Like what does that look like for people who are queer or people who are, not as comfortable talking, about themselves in their workspace?
Yeah, well, I mean, you talk about coming out and we talk about it as if it's a single time that happens, but people come out 50 to 100 to hundreds of times in their career. I probably had to reiterate, and so, yeah, it is. I mean, I think throughout it's been a choice. Do you say my wife? Do you say my partner? Depending on where you are. And, I graduated university in 2009. And even then, like I remember being in a class just a few years earlier, and it was kind of like, how do you conduct business in other countries, And it was very like you fit into their customs and you fit into whatever that is. And I remember the example at the time was, say, for instance, you're in Texas. Would you wear like facial piercings and things like that? Like maybe not. You might consider. And I remember like I learned this in school. And then I remember years later, I was doing business in Texas. I'm gay and I look and I have my nose ring in and I was like, oh my God, all my learnings are out the window. This deal is going sideways. And so, but I think the thing that I think about there though is that you have to be aware of these things, and that doesn't really cross, what that looks like. And to your point, do you have do I get a pass sometimes because I might look maybe people think I'm straight, maybe, right? But because of that, I also have come out a whole bunch of times. And so it's a really interesting thing. I mean, I think also what really plays in is your identity, right? So everyone has a whole bunch of different things in how they view their identity. For myself, I view myself as like a family member, like a partner, an athlete, or maybe like has been wannabe athlete at this point, but like in my head, an athlete. and and gay, and it's probably in that order, right? And so it's just there's a whole bunch of things. And so I think when you talk about like how do you bring yourself to work, I don't know necessarily have to bring our whole selves to work. I don't know. Like I do want people to be genuine and authentic. I don't know what the right balance of that is. I want people to be authentic, and that's why I live in this province, because I think people are very authentic and very grounded, and so those are really important qualities. But I think it really depends on how you view your identity and how you want to represent yourself, and whatever makes you comfortable. But I mean, the clear line there is that no one should impact that except yourself and how you choose to be that way.
Absolutely. So to your point, like we all have lots of different intersectionalities, the way we see yourself. So the first thing I always say about myself is I'm queer or gay or lesbian. That's the first thing I always say. That's my first go-to. And depending on people's comfort levels, it's not always other people's first go-tos. And that's great, right? But it's how we see ourselves. You know, I'm a fur mama as well. Like I'm, a wife, a daughter, a business owner. So it's all these different things and how they intersect. And it's interesting because you talk about coming out, like goodness, I can't even tell you how many times I've came out. Like it's just so many times. And if you're part of the heteronormative community or straight community, you never have to say, I'm straight and I have a wife or I have a husband. Never, right? But when you're part of this community, it can be awkward, and it can be one of those times where you just kind of try to center yourself to your comfort zone and what that looks like. And sometimes we may choose not to come out and cover parts of our identities in business because it's the safer thing to do. You mentioned Texas. When we had the privilege of taking a cruise last year, one of the places we got off was Texas at the end. And 4 of us as friends, who are all part of the queer community, we said, we're friends. As soon as we got into a cab, the person said, how do you all know each other? And there was religious symbols on every dashboard, or religious symbols hanging from every mirror when we're in Texas. So it's just one of those places, like, remember that we're in the US, and a lot of people carry guns, and this is not home anymore, and we're in a different space. So just acknowledge that. And it's okay for us to do a little bit of a covering, which we did a lot of covering, right? Like we were no longer married. We were all friends traveling together. So, and a friend of mine who never says anything, she pipes up and was the first one saying, oh, we're all friends traveling together, right? So it's just one of those moments of safety, because safety is a factor, right? Of just whatever that is, wherever you're to, just recognize that, is this a safer space, right? So for me, my safest space or safer space is at home. Hasn't always been at work. So it's kind of treading water to see where that's to as people, right?
Got it. And I think I have felt like I think I've lucked into the work category through my career, both in like who I've worked with, the companies I've worked with, and not that they've been so overtly like loud and proud or anything like that. Like really, it's like business was business, right? But the people were just really good people, like I didn't feel that. And maybe it was part of how I was presenting it. I wasn't having it either. So it was a bit of a combo, but everyone has different personalities. And so I always think like I'm more like likely to like plow through something and run at something, but there's a lot of different personalities, and not everyone is comfortable in that space. And so I think that there is an onus on the rest of us to create some comfort and some safety for folks to be able to step up and to be themselves. Like I think about this only in 2010, I think, like it was not, 15 years ago, but that was right when I was graduating. And there was that kind of like national campaign that came out that was It Gets Better. And like, if I think about that, it would bring a tear to my eye to see one of those commercials now. But it makes me mad because I'm like, it was so bad. Like, it was so bad for people, and there was no solution. It wasn't like, here's a solution. It was just like, keep going. It'll get better. And I thought, like, is that it? And I think it like served its purpose, and I actually have an appreciation for that campaign. But at the same time, I'm like, is that as good as we can do? I don't believe it, and so I think we can do a lot better.
Yeah, and I think as a society and as in Newfoundland and Labrador, we're starting to shift and get to a space where we need to be on business side and personal side. But the trans community, a community that I know folks who are part of that community, and they're part of our community, the 2S LGBTQ plus community. They're getting a lot of hate. I don't get as much hate. I get pieces of hate at times, pending on who I'm in the room with, some of the conversation. But our trans community is definitely under attack in Canada and in the US, and it's just it breaks my heart that someone can't live their true authentic self of who they are, to be able to just kind of just be, right, just be able to survive, to love, and to be in business. And it's one of those things of the benefits of us being who we are and stepping outside our comfort zones, but what that means, on both ends.
Definitely. Yeah. And so that's kind of where I am a little bit now. Like I my whole career, I've stepped outside my comfort zone. I've loved it. It's been something that like has been both fulfilling and helpful to me kind of along the way. But I think, and this is probably like a privileged thing to say as well, but I think the older I get now, the more, you want to work on things that have impacts for yourselves. Like I want to work with, which is why I started my consulting companies, because I want to work with people who want to make an impact, and maybe they're professionals in their field, and they're doctors or they're lawyers or whatever that may be. They're experts in their niche, in their field, but they don't necessarily know how to build a tech company or things like that, or they need support at different times. And so that's kind of my goal now, is I want to work with people who are really trying to make an impact in what they do and that kind of need that support. And then on the second side of that, I'm like, okay, what can I do that's a little bit more proactive? And that's a little bit pushing myself out of my comfort zone. Because I always say, like my wife is from the US, and I would say she's a good gay and I'm a bad gay, because she's very informed and she knows exactly what's happening, and she is like proud and but she wasn't always like, she actually had to kind of grow into that, and I am bad in that I am less I am less of an activist, or less, I would say, like vocal than she would be around certain things. But where we meet in the middle is kind of that black or white line of like what's right and what's wrong, and we always align on that. And so I'm just trying to be a bit of a better gay if I can, as I'm growing out my career.
But it's interesting that, you use that language, because what does it mean to be a good gay or bad gay? And you take it as you have to be an advocate, but to me is to be true to yourself, to be able to, if there's teachable moments that come up, to be able to take on some of those, to do that sachet, right, amongst the tech community, to be able to take the opportunities to introduce like a diversity inclusion moment to, it's the small things that are the big wins to me. Like it's, like what are we putting out there, when it comes to pronouns? Because let's be honest, younger generations, they're so fluid in their sexuality, their gender orientations, and industry and tech space. We're not ready for that yet. Like we need to kind of get to that comfort level of people who they are, and just like, okay, awesome. How can I help you like thrive, like kind of going down that road in that conversation? How can I best support you, right? Looking at it from that different lens.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. I mean, I always think about representation, and like what am I thinking of in terms of what's a successful business person and what does that look like? And I mean, definitely I wasn't thinking about joining tech. We actually always had a joke that when I joined tech 15 years ago, and we'd sit around and say, how did you get into tech? They'd be like, just like everyone else, I fell into tech, So I did kind of purposely go into that. And then at the time, like in a sales career, it was, there's 25% probably female representation or female identifying representation in tech. Within the niche of that, there's probably 25% more that filled a sales role. And there just were no other stats beyond that. There's no more counting after that. That's too much of a niche, just having females in a certain role. So, I wasn't thinking like, how can I be this, like, whatever my goal is to be, who does that look like? But I had a lot of really kind of strong women around me in my career, but also my dad was a lawyer, and there was a lot of really like amazing lawyers at the time that I looked up to, whether they know it or not. And then my mom and I come from a matriarchal family, so my grandma raised 10 kids on her own, and just they bowed down to her, and so then that was always the way it was, and that's what I kind of learned from. And so, anyways, I think that that gives you a bit of not confidence, but it levels the stage a little bit. So I wasn't coming kind of like on the back foot into the world. I was really like pushing. I was, walking firmly forward at all times.
That's interesting. Because families, they do play a role in where we're to and the privilege that we have, and kind of where we get to, where we're going to. Like that's because I think this really is a journey of business that you're on, and starting up a new consultancy firm and what that looks like for you as a strategist, and where to from here. Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think it's funny. So I really like my dad since passed, but he was just I'm very happy to have him as a voice in my head, and kind of like where's my compass and where's that going, because he was a lawyer. He was a very smart business person, but he was a very kind man, and he was very diplomatic and generous with his time. And so I'm really glad to kind of have that as the compass, but I remember being in university and just talking to him, and he was my person, and I'm just talking to him and being like, well, I don't know what I want to do, and he's like, listen, it's like, you're going to be fine. Doesn't matter. And he wouldn't say that unless he really believed it. And I remember thinking like, where's this guy getting that confidence? I don't know what I'm doing, and so I remember that, because I knew that I probably wasn't going to do a typical role of whatever that looked like. I knew I wasn't going to come out and be, name a role. Like I knew I wasn't going to be a nurse or a lawyer or like a role that you have in your head, because I've always just been curious, and I've always kind of wanted to. I've been pretty open, I guess, or flexible in the work that I do. And I think because of that, once I started working, I got really curious, and I ended up taking on a bunch of stuff because I was curious, how do we do this? Or can I do that? Let's go try it out. So I don't have like a linear path on what that looks like. I think my goal now is I feel like confident in the work I've done. I really like when tech companies are in their build phase. I did some really hard builds for probably the last 6 years, and they take, all your effort, might, and to make them successful. And so I do think that people ebb and flow in their career and what they want to achieve. My goal right now is that I want to help build tech companies. I worked for a company in the US in the pandemic, and they were building their tech company. And I had, over 10 years experience at that time in big sales. And I remember feeling overwhelmed at one point. And I just thought, how do people do this? How do founders do this who don't have that 10 years of sales experience? Like, how do they know what to do and not feel overwhelmed? They must feel really overwhelmed at times. And then almost overnight, I started kind of consulting with folks, and I started working with female founders, because that's where I thought I could probably make a bigger impact. And so even now, 2 years later, I try to keep my companies I work with, I try to keep it a bit of an even split. And not that female founders need my help more than male founders, nothing like that. But if I'm going to put time and effort towards something, and I want to see the success as well. But I've been really lucky to work with like really, really great companies. I've never gone into a company and it hasn't been like a very almost like trusted advisor relationship. People are really open to working, to changing. And so like anyone, you want to work somewhere that's trying to make an impact. And so I've been really lucky that the companies that I work with are trying to solve big problems, and they're very authentic humans. And so I feel very lucky to do that. I could do that for the rest of my days and be happy. But at the same time, I also see some challenges that are there, like bringing in consultants can be hard, both from a time and money perspective. And so there's some early pitfalls that I really think early stage companies can avoid. But unless they have someone to come in and tell them, I mean, that's not always feasible. So I'm kind of, in the last 2 years, I've been observing certain points, I guess, in the process of builds that are more impactful and more kind of like common pitfalls that are happening. And so I think the next evolution of the consulting side is that I'll probably build out some sort of I'm in my head now, it's a digital sales toolkit, but it could be anything, some kind of automation that doesn't require a human to come in and analyze what's happening at certain of these stages. So anyways, that's kind of that's where I think I see the next piece of it going for the Rivet side of things.
Awesome. Well, that's really exciting. Yeah. So if folks want to, we'll end this part of this part that we're going to have a conversation, because we're going to start another conversation in a second. But if folks want to reach out, they want to work with your fantastic self, how can they reach out to you? Where can they reach you? What spaces are you in?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn a lot. So LinkedIn, also there's a website, rivetgrowth.com. If you just went to rivet.com, you will see little rivets, which is what binds ships together. so rivetgrowth.com, there's an info page there around some of the folks I've gotten to work with, which has been awesome. But mostly it's been through referrals and things like that. So feel free to reach out directly, and always happy to see what people are building and up to.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today.